Hi there, and welcome to Pax Politica. It's 2025, and even with a plethora of career options for us to choose from, it is quite common to hear creative pursuits being dubbed as passion projects. But let's pause for a moment. What if our passion projects could untangle years of trauma, guilt, remorse, and perhaps anger that grew in an environment of fear and uncertainty? Think it's possible? Let's find out. Cue the music. Several studies conducted over years of research have demonstrated that dance, theatre, and similar performing arts are effective approaches for treating symptoms of trauma among survivors and witnesses of war. In a country like Colombia, however, where conflict has been long, bloody, multi-layered, and complex, such studies barely scratch the surface. So, in this video, we sat down with Natalia Medina, who has been working with Fundación Prolongar, a non-profit in Bogota over the last couple of years. We discussed her early years as a student activist, working with indigenous groups along Colombia's Caribbean coast, her time at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and her thoughts on the use of art and creativity for building peace. So, stick around and don't forget to subscribe for more such content. Hi, Natalia. Welcome to our podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
What do you remember from your childhood with respect to the conflict? What was Colombia like back in the 90s?
I think in Bogota, we have no idea about what is conflict for real, the dimension of that. My first memory related with that was 1999. I was 10 years old, almost 11. And Jaime Garzón, the reporter, comedian, an actor, political activist, was murdered. We didn't know from who, but the hypothesis was paramilitaries with state forces in alliance. And I was a child, and he was somebody that I saw at the TV making political jokes and performing different characters. And I wanted to be an actor since then. So it was traumatic because I was confused, like why somebody like him was murdered. That doesn't make any sense because I didn't understand how somebody that did an artistic job will be killed for that. And then I study also in a high school that is by Bolivar Square in the city center.
Yeah.
So
Which one?
Colegio Mayor de San Bartolomé.
Okay.
It's in the corner.
I've seen that.
So
one, yeah.
every time that something important happened at the country or at the city, mainly, we were there. So I remember going outside after high school to protest in the Bolivar Square because he was murdered.
But then I've also heard that a lot of ex-presidents, people in the government and bureaucracy also graduated from San Bartolomeo, right? Yeah. So like, were your school years also sort of elitist, or were you exposed to a lot of Colombia's political history because of the school you went to?
Yeah, I was for the 400 years promotion.
Okay.
So there was a lot of talking and pressure about ourselves because we were that promotion. I was the second promotion with girls. And every time they were talking about the former presidents that were studied there, and also the Jesuitas, they have some idea about education that you have to study different dimensions. So that's something that is good. So I have like social services, environmental group, scouts, travels. So different spaces beyond the normal academics where I was able to be in contact with other issues in the country, included armed conflict. We did a leadership course.
Yeah.
That was one of topics. Like, now I see that in perspective, and I think it was not the more responsible thing to do. But in one of the courses, the facilitators pretend a role game with a kidnapping, something like these kind of things, to make us conscious, aware about what was happening in Colombia, but from a educational, more responsible way.
But I'll tell you what. So did you ever feel that the dominant narrative, based on what you were learning or what you were exposed to in school, was sort of supportive of what the government was telling the people? Did it include, for example, perspectives from Las FARC or other guerrilla groups as well?
I think it depends of the teachers. Like, I have even the priest. I think inside the Catholic Church in South America, we have this very right-wing trend that is dominant. And some of the priests in the high school were like that. But we have also the freedom theology, and we had priests like that in the high school too. I was not able to tell those days who was from what tendency, but now in perspective, I can see that I was exposed to both. And in my social science teachers were usually the ones that, for example, they make us make debates about topics. I remember the Iraq war. So we had to study different perspectives and then make a debate with different viewpoints. But being honest, related to our armed conflict, it was not one of the main topics. I think the dominant narrative could be seen in the fact that it was not one of the main topics. It was like a little bit hidden in terms of the dimension of what was happening in our country. It was easier to talk about another war rather than our own conflict.
So how did Jaime's murder change your perspective?
I think it's...
In fact, did Jaime's murder change your perspective at all?
Yeah, I mean, I am 36 now, and I still remember, I still cry. Last time that I was at the Memorial Center, the district one, they have a sculpture with this character that he had, the one with the shoes, El Embolador.
Okay.
And I was there and I saw it and I started to cry again because it makes me feel pain.
Why?
I think because it reminds me how Colombians are both able to create very funny and artistic and creative things or kill those things. It's like same people, same context. So I think it changed me in terms of making me more aware about that the conflict could damage people that I know, that I love, even though it was, a famous person that I never met in person. I think it's like, it's something similar with what happened in 2019, El Estallido Social. For many people was like, this is our conflict too. This is our problem too. So I think that was the thing in my head.
In other words, after Jaime's murder, the conflict became personal for you.
Yeah, small, like the first steps to make it closer to me.
What happened after that?
I was in these leadership courses that I told you before. That was based on the spiritual exercise from San Ignacio. But just base, because from there they took it far.
Yeah, of course.
So it was designed from students, from former students of this course. And it was called Curso Taller, because at the mornings you have like theoretical things, and in the afternoons you have workshops. So at the mornings we work. First day was myself, then was like group, then family, then country, South America, and the world, something like that. And we have this kind of role games, and we were like 14 years old the first time that I went.
Mm-hmm.
And I questioned a lot of things there for the first time beyond it was not super rigorous.
Right.
It was a good idea to took me outside high school and be there 1 week thinking in those kind of things. And one of the issues that came when we were in the Colombia Day and in the South American Day was the conflict. So it was more, I think that grew up my interest in social issues, not just conflict, but among the social issues, the conflict. And I think that led me to choose political science as a bachelor degree 3 years later.
What about your family? Like, did they feel as strongly and passionately about Jaime's murder just as much as you did?
Yeah, no, not specifically about the murder, although I think we never have spoke about it. Maybe it will be interesting to ask them. Mm-hmm. But my parents, they are both teachers.
Okay.
And they were both from the union. They met there. Especially my dad is very like left-wing, radical. My mom less, but still they were both sensitive to protest, to discuss about inequality, justice. So that was part of my influence. And also my family, my mother's family and my grandfather. He was very liberal. So we had this course at home, but no specifically related with armed conflict yet.
Did you ever have heated, intense discussions about the conflict at home where people had a difference of opinion?
Not much, because we were usually agree.
Okay.
But it's more this kind of discussions where we complain about others. You know, the emotion would be related about how it's possible that the people in this country is so stupid or indifferent to injustice, to poverty.
I'm only
like even at the high school, when we have this, for example, we lead a protest at the interior of the high school, and some of the parents would not agree with what we do, but my parents were agree. So with this kind of discussion.
I'm only asking you this because we're doing this recording at La Casa de la Paz, a place that was founded by a former Las FARC member. Now, it's interesting for me when you say that people in your family more or less agreed with each other when it came to understanding why the conflict in Colombia is happening in the first place. Would it then be fair to say that your family understood or at least empathized with the motives of the FARC, despite all the violence, all the attacks, all the lives lost that were taking place?
No, I think they were more, at the moment when my dad was younger, he was more closer to sympathize with M19. But I think, and I knew that because when I went then after to National University, one of the fears from them were that I might be recruited.
Yeah.
For the way I was thinking.
Of course.
So I think they empathize with the general perspective of we live in an unfair country. There is a lot of injustice. inequality. But I think that in the spectrum, they were even if the left-wing spectrum, if far was here, they will be like something like here. At least in their own perception, because the times too. Maybe my dad in the 70s, he felt closer, but the more time passed, the more the conflict get bloodier, more drug trafficking and other dynamics were involved. He was more, going further to more like the social democracy, right. This kind of politics.
That's really interesting, because I happened to meet somebody from Universidad Nacional as well. And he was telling me that a lot of under-the-table recruitment still happens.
Yeah.
At Universidad Nacional. And I thought that was really interesting. In fact, based on what he told me, it was one of the few places where students, faculty members, having completely different opinions to each other, actually engaged with each other, had discussions, had debates, sometimes led protest movements. But there were other people I happened to speak to as well who were from right-wing universities, Del Rosario, for example. And I thought that the differences between the perceptions that these people had based on where they studied was really interesting, was really fascinating. What do you remember from your time at Universidad Nacional, especially what was the dominant feeling among the students as far as the conflict was concerned?
Yeah, that was part of a big change.
Yeah.
I started university at 16 years old. Yeah, I came
2004, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I came from this high school where I was more or less protected anyway. So it was like shocking for me, this change. First of all, because it's elite. No social, but academic. So we encounter people from the base high school from all the country.
Yeah.
So first, I felt stupid compared with all of them. Second, it was the feeling of being in a national space for real. So I have indigenous people in my classes, Black people. So it was also the notion of Colombia is not just Bogota, but also at the political level. The first things that you saw is murals from different guerrillas, from different social movements, and the assemblies, the protests every semester for different things. And I became involved in that. I was part of a social student organization at the end. And I knew about the existence of organizaciones clandestinas. I knew who were them, but I was never invited. But I knew, and I learned to be in the same place, even though we have like different perspectives, especially about violence and the use of violence. But it was interesting what you say, that we have really alive discussions in class and also in the assemblies about deep topics like how legitimate is the political violence or not, or how is the meaning of peace or justice, but still a lot in the theoretical level.
Do you remember any discussions becoming violent? Like physically violent?
Yeah.
Aggressive? Yeah? Can you share any?
I have a student colleague. He called himself a fascist.
Okay.
And he even painted his face with like white powder.
Wow. Okay.
To look whiter. And he was in my semester.
Uh-huh.
And all the time he was, like arguing against the left wing and in favor of Hitler and things like that. And we were used to. We were used to that, and teachers too. But once we were outside the faculty, and two guys from, I don't know, like which left-wing organization came, asked for him and punch him and kick him. And at the end, when it became more serious, we intervened to stop the fight and say, okay, we are at the university, leave him alone. And it was funny because he was like covered in blood. He was losing the fight. And he still say like, you see, this is the left wing. I have told you. And we were like, shut up. We were helping you. So it was like this time. But in my generation, the violence inside the university was more questioned. But I have colleagues and teachers that tell us stories from the past where, I don't know, a right-wing professor say something and his car was stolen or was put in fire.
Wow.
Or, there was somebody from this combo, left-wing combo, that have a fight with another, and he came with a gun and say, okay, we're going to fight. So that was happening before us, like in the 90s.
So it was...
That was...
So during your time, the university was a little less violent, but it was aggressive anyway.
Yeah, and we have Las Pedreas, El Tropel. Every month was quite often, but it became landscape for you. Like even when it's funny, like when you see it on perspective, sometimes we're like, please, God, give me a tropel today because I have this test and I have not studied. Please, I need the class be canceled. And then many people went to see like seeing the movies. Now, again, when you saw in perspective, you are like, okay, this is it's part of the violence too. And it was natural for us.
But in hindsight, when you look back at your time in university today, do you miss being at university?
Of course. That was part of my favorite times at life because anyways, when I pass the door, when I cross the door, it feels like a independence territory at the city for everything, for the good things and the bad things. You have culture, you have people from different parts of the country. You have also the possibility of use drugs without nobody bothering you. And you have this political discussion permanently, like research groups or in the squares. We were very involved also in the political, the national politics. So when, I don't know, teachers start a protest, we were there and we were the young people, the creative. So it was a time where a lot of things happened there and I have so much free time like never before. So we were all the time like producing theoretically, but also in terms of art, the organization that I was part at the end. And at that time, I wanted to be an actress already. So we proposed things like, we don't want to give the people like a folleto with like
small
letters and saying, there is inequality in our country. 20 million people are in poverty, because I found it that bored and dogmático, sectario.
Yeah.
So we proposed things like, let's do a noticiero like Jaime did. So we did something, tried to perform in something similar to what Jaime Garzón did, and we did a 30 minutes program talking about the country and the problems at the university. We did clown sketch. We made a song about the financial crisis at the university. And that was part of my like social work at the end at university. So because I had a lot of time to write the scripts, put it in place, and the National University was the perfect public to take these kind of products and ideas.
But then, when did you decide to become an actress, and why?
That was like 5 years ago. Okay. But I had been close to performing, dancing, singing, and acting since I am a child, because before the Jesuitas, I studied in an art school.
Hi there. Hope you're enjoying this video. If you've stuck around so far, I'd just like to take a moment of your time and appreciate your support towards helping us keeping this channel up and running. If you like the work we do here, the stories we tell, and the issues we cover, please do hit the like button under this video and subscribe to our channel. Every like helps YouTube's algorithm in recommending this to more people just like you, and in the long run, allowing us to keep producing similar content. So if you haven't liked this already, now's your chance. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so one of the things that actually fascinated me a lot about Colombia, art and visual communication have always been extremely strong and deeply embedded elements in Latin American history when it comes to social movements, protests, demonstrations, human rights, etc. Visual communication through graffitis, posters, music, for example, have always been very, very important. So for you, when you were at Universidad Nacional, was art always a way of expressing yourself, or did you discover that side to yourself when you were at university?
I think a bit of both, since I have this curiosity about art since I was a child and was supported by my parents too, who exposed me to theater, to museums. But at university, for example, I discovered the street art. I didn't made it myself, but I was always there, like bringing the water or the ideas. Then somebody else's do it, the mural or things like that. Also, I remember in sociology, they have this journal that was fantastic. It was called El Pasquín. I remember that it cost 1,000 pesos. And the day that they publish it, something like every Wednesday, you had it to be alert because it goes super fast.
Yeah.
It was very creative, funny. They have good drawing, design, and it was very political too. Also the theater, the dance, all the national official arts groups were very recognized at the country. And that was that. So I saw that, but also in the protest, I was always part of the communication committee because I found it bored to be at the assembly just talking or in the discussion. So I found that communication and arts were a way to make it funnier for myself to be in the social movement, for me. But also, I found that when we use these kind of languages, people want to follow us. People want to join us.
Yeah.
I remember also in one December that we were still in protest, and we have this in 7th December, El Día de las Velitas. Mm-hmm. And we were doing los faroles that were like, Viva la Universidad Nacional. And then we sold them. Yeah. So people put their candles and we, we did things like that. Or let's do a protest, no with walking, let's do it biking. And dress it with costumes. And that become more interesting to people, to normal people, to civilians outside the university, to join us or to empathize with our causes. So I discovered that at university.
Okay, so right then after university, or rather during university, do you feel that all the experiences you had with your peer group, the art groups you were a part of, the discussions, the debates, the faculty, and everything put together. Do you feel that it changed or it affected the way you looked at the conflict in any way? How?
Yeah, like, first of all, makes me really conscious about the history behind the conflict. It was not just what I saw at the news, or even, the hymes there, the things that I saw in TV. So I have a class that was called Political Violence, like history, Colombian history. I remember also constitutionalism, where every topic that we learn, it takes us back in history and also into complexities. I think it opened my mind to how difficult was to understand and to solve this conflict, since his roots in equality, in history, colonialism, the land problem. Yeah. University, and also the organization that I joined at the end, we have there a center that was called RAISAL, Instituto de Pensamiento Latinoamericano. And I was very young, but I have discussions with people that were already teachers and in other universities, and they have met the country, indigenous organizations, peasants. So they have a lot of information about how the conflict, but also the social resistance was lived for real in the territories. I use that work a lot, for example, because I learn with these people something that they call el enfoque territorial.
Yeah.
And we try to use it for the way that we approach our work at uni. So that was first thing in the theoretical level. But also I was too much into that, so I wanted to be like Camilo Torres.
Okay.
So I wanted to study French, to go to Lovaina and study there and become more expert in the theoretical level of understanding like social issues, let's say. So I went to Canada, to Montreal, to study French. But then there, I make myself conscious about the migration issue. And I don't know, it happened, this migration thing, that when you are far away, you become more aware and worried about your own country. And I was like, I don't want to go to Lovaina to study any theoretical thing. We have a lot of problems, like as Colombians, as South Americans, including migration and conflict. I wanted to do more practical. So I came back, and that was complementary to the theoretical. I have this call for doing something.
And what did you do then?
I was candidate from the local assembly in Bogota. We have localidades. So I was living in Teusaquillo, and I run in an election.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was very involved in El Polo Democrático Alternativo. That was the left-wing political party. And I almost get there.
Okay.
It was like 80 votes or something.
Ooh, that's close.
Yeah. But thanks to that, I always celebrate that defeat, because I was in a relationship, and in that moment he was in Santa Marta working with fishermen organizations that were affected by La Ola Invernal, because we don't have winter, right? But they call it like that. And we have this agreement that if I won the election, he will come back and be by my side, helping me with that. But if I lost, I'll go there. So I went there, and that was the final hit that I needed to know that was peace and conflict was my thing. Because in Santa Marta, we live toques de queda. We met real people that were direct victims from conflict, but also real people that have resistance process against violence. And I was like, this is the most important issue that we have to attend, because anything that we tried to do, like this project was not related with conflict, but anything that we tried to do to help was always touching or crossing with the conflict. Right. And there I was like, if Colombia do not respond this question about the violence, we won't be able to do anything else.
This is actually something that I really want to touch upon. So as a teenager, 18, 19, or early 20s for that matter, and I'm trying to recollect how I was and how I looked at the world at that age. It's one thing to study about peace and conflict theoretically. It's one thing to read about, these many people died, or these many people were survivors and victims of the conflict. Today, we can see pictures of people and children who survive conflict, right? But you're not directly engaging with them. The only engagement you have is by looking at pictures in newspapers. At that age, when you were in your late teens or early 20s for that matter, you had a direct face-to-face interaction with victims and survivors of the conflict. What was that like? How did that make you feel at that age?
When I went to Santa Marta, I have 22.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was in my 20s. It was shocking and was very changing. It gave me perspective about my privilege to be Bogotana, to live in a city, to study in that university, to be able to travel.
Right.
Especially, these fishermen, one of these organization was, they were victims of a massacre. And that massacre had the forced displacement effect too. And was very impressive for me how they managed to survive with very less resources and to fight for being recognized as victims, but also as survivors. Their way of living shocked me, their resistance, their resilience was for me, gave me a lot of strength and power to feel motivated, to be resilient myself, because I was like, these people have survived everything, a lot, and they still have hope, and they still sing and make jokes. And I remember we did a mural, because one of the problems with this small area in La Ciénaga Grande de Santa Marta, they were palafitos, this kind of architecture on the water. And since there were very few people, and most of them have left the place because of the massacre, La Gobernación del Magdalena said that they didn't exist anymore. That this corregimiento was called Bocas de Aracataca, they didn't exist.
Wow.
In the office eyes. And one of the things that we did was at the entrance of the little town, we made a mural that says Bocas de Aracataca existe porque resiste.
Right.
And I remember those kind of that was beautiful, right? Because it was like, they never thought about doing a mural, but we just became outside the uni. We did murals, and they inspired us to say that because it's what we saw. It's like, of course you exist because you are here and you have survived. And this kind of things that we did was this encounter between this resistant story and the few things that we knew from coming from the university and the city, and being sensitive and open to listen their stories too.
What kind of stories like really stayed in your mind and memory? Something that deeply, genuinely affected you?
In that time or in general?
General, definitely, but in that time, yeah, surely. As a 22-year-old, I'm guessing you must have heard a lot, which really made you stop, think, and wonder. I mean, wow.
Yeah, I remember that like this small community, like working with people that all of them have at least one dead victim in their family. Yeah. That was something that I never was exposed before. Like even myself, I never had a relative that have died, even for natural causes. So listening when they talk about how their families were killed or raped, and in this natural way, like right now, like telling any story, that was one side shocking, but another side was again like inspiring, because people telling these stories from very strange perspective. No, like the victims that are crying and they need help.
Yeah,
there was more survivors. So that's also what I tell you about the el toque de queda, or the way that the city was built, the way that the people relate. That was also very shocking, because it was very influenced in that time from the paramilitaries.
Right.
And I can feel it, because I came, for example, the way I dress, the way I talk, it was questioned at the beginning from some neighbors, or, that made me notice it, that the paramilitary forces have won the cultural fight. They were able to impose, for example, they closed the theater. Yeah, most of the people have very conservative ideas about women, about, hippies, things that defeat their social order. And I felt it myself in a very subtle way compared, I didn't die, but I felt it. And it was, it was depressing for me, because my feeling was like they won. Because people that were opposing this way of thinking, this social regulation, these cultural restrictions, were rather murdered or disappear, or displaced. And I was living in that post-moment, post-context, where they already imposed a new culture.
So by your early to mid-20s, you studied at Universidad Nacional, you ran for elections, you went to Montreal to study French, returned to Colombia, and then you were part of a cultural group working with victims of the conflict in Santa Marta. What did you do then? What did you do in life after that?
I lived for 3 years in Santa Marta.
Uh-huh.
But that was my basic or my main place.
Yeah.
But because of the job was hard to find, so I was living for a while in Valledupar, Cartagena, Barranquilla. I was moving in the Caribe corner. And I did cultural things for myself and trying to rescue these few traces from before the paramilitary times. And I went to I got this job that I was telling you before in el Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica, Dirección de Acuerdos de la Verdad. That was part from the transitional justice process with the paramilitaries.
That was a truth commission?
Yeah.
Kind of.
Kind of. I say kind of because it was a little department inside the National Historical Center that was in charge of interviewing paramilitaries from middle and low range to ask them from what they know and what they remember about the conflict in exchange of
amnesty. Tell me more about your time at the Truth Commission. You must have met a lot of people, or at least witnessed a lot of cases related to the conflict. What was that like for you? Was it disturbing?
Yeah, it was. First of all, because the moral responsibility. We design a methodology, we a big group, a methodology where we use some criteria like correspondencia, consistencia, coherencia, suficiencia, and something else to decide if each person was contributing or not to truth. So that's very like, what? Like challenging. So that was first problem for me, because was, even though, of course, the decision was not only mine, I was just part of the process. Many people review the process before me and after me. But I was part of the process. So part of my criteria was influencing the fact that a real human being could go to jail or not, or could be contributing or not to the memory, to the victims. So that was like a lot of pressure. And also something that was very important for me was like, anyway, I still have more theoretical things in my head than experience. So I tend to, every time that I interview somebody, I make a new hypothesis, a new theory. And then next day, my theory and my hypothesis was destroyed, because the next story was way more complex than the previous one. It opened my political views too, because at that time I was very left-wing, sided, and I had a lot of bias because of that. And when you hear stories from people that when I was a child, my dad was at the ELN, but then he was called for paramilitaries, and then my mom was in FARC, and was like things that show you that the war is not about some good people and bad people, and it's not simple. It's bloody, it's complex, and it have a lot to do with the social inequalities, with people that engage in the groups, not because they believe, it's because they have to, or because it's the only thing that they saw, but then they are revenge, love, funny stories in the war too. Sometimes you expect, or I was expecting stories, about the massacre, the homicides, and people want to tell you about funny things that remember how they felt the group was their family, how they miss be recognized for the people, how they also help the people. So it was very interesting, because it was every time to see that the war, the conflict, and the human being was way more complex than I thought.
Did you ever feel that the people you were meeting, the testimonies you were recording, there was a sense of denial among people?
Yeah, a lot. We have, in the method, we have two interviews. So usually at the first interview, we ask from our general things. We build a profile. And according to that profile, we make a hypothesis. Like, if this person was in this territory in those years with these responsibilities, at least have to know about this, and this. So the second interview was usually more interesting because they came with the same attitude that in the first one, where they want just to talk about general things, not bloody things. And then we are like, okay, let's talk. And yeah, it was hard from a lot of them to revisit the bloody aspects, to talk about their own responsibilities. They were in denial also because some years have passed. So a lot of them wanted to leave that in the past. So when we came to revisit that, it wasn't pleasant. And also there are fears about the people that were about them.
Yeah.
They can, punish them.
But then, what were people more comfortable talking about when it came to the conflict? Was it, for example, what they had lost? Or was it, for example, what they had done themselves?
Comfortable about what others did, about why the guerrillas were the bad guys, how they help people, how they build roads, or things like that makes themselves also feel they did something good.
But you know what, one of the things I've often noticed among people who record testimonies of conflict, and I include myself in that category, was that a lot of people, victims and survivors alike, or those who have even committed acts of violence, they often feel and they argue, what is the point of us giving you our testimony? Nothing is going to happen. You will not do anything with it. Instead, we will give you our testimony, and it will only go as 1 or 2 lines in a piece of paper, on a report. And nothing will happen with that report at all. Did people come to you with this kind of criticism as well?
Yeah, even myself. Because sometimes it becomes frustrating, have this great amount of information. I know that there are going to be reports, and there are reports about it. They have published many books to explain some of the dynamic in the regions, how the groups were created, who funded the groups, all of that. But sometimes for them, and also for me, was like, but how this contribute not to the general history, the general memory, but to me? Yeah, they question that. Or they question the fact that also like the power dynamics, right? Like most of them, they were like the low levels. So they were still poor, they were still without power. So they were like, and the bad guys, the real bad guys, are not giving these interviews. So they question it.
And how did you resolve this confusion, this discomfort within yourself? Knowing that, okay, the people I'm talking to have questions, have concerns about what is going to happen with my testimony. But then you have a job to do as well. So how did you come to terms with that confusion?
I think by doing my job, a good job. I was very rigorous. I took a lot of time doing researching, contrasting sources, trying to not let my left-wing view or my emotions during the interview, because some of them, they challenged me during the interview. So with this kind of people, I was really like, okay, I have to take some time to meditate, to take apart my emotions, how I felt, to try to do my job the more objective way possible. And sometimes I have this form where I can put my observation, and I put a lot of there to let them know I had bias about this person because, I don't know, this day I was tired, it was very hot, things like that. And also I think to live in the heroina. Like I was not doing this job to save anybody, which is part of, I think, was something that have saved me from this idea of, I'm not doing this to save anybody. I'm doing this because I have interest in this. Because it's not my place to save rather the victims or the country or the memory or the peace. I'm just like a small part of a big process that is not up to me, or it's not just up to me.
And after working with the Truth Commission, did you then move to working with the HEP?
No, I went to Cali.
Okay.
And one of the reasons was because that was really exhausting to do every day. Yeah, I quit because I wanted a change. And I wanted a change to work with more like the positive side, let's call. So I went to Cali. I worked with Javeriana University. They have Intercultural Studies Center. And they work with the South communities, indigenous, Black people, peasants. Yeah, it was like working on other side of the conflict, the ones that are in resistance, the civilians. I think I was worried to be empathizing too much with the bad guys, with the combatants. I think I was looking for, like being close again from the perspective of the one that have suffered more. Because that was good. Because, of course, the ex-combatants are human beings too and have complex stories and all of that. But the ones that have suffered more in this country are the civilians. So I was there 2 years, and I worked with in Buenaventura with a river that is called Yurumangui. It's a Black community. And also with peasants and indigenous people from Cauca. So I saw this perspective, and was very important to see the peace initiatives that they have despite the government, the armed groups, wherever, like all the things that they do from their freedom and autonomy, despite having or not resources or support to do that. And that was very interesting.
After spending almost 10 months in Colombia, working on peace education, meeting ex-combatants, etc., as you said earlier, human beings are complex. It's made me realize that it's not always a matter of black or white. People are fighting and supporting their own values, or values that they believe in from time to time. So why was it problematic for you to feel that you were sympathizing with people who were committing violence when you were with the Truth Commission?
I think I was tired. I was tired to receive like the sad part of the history. It was taking hope from me. It was uploading me with a way that it wasn't mine. And I started to feel like I'm empowered, that this is a lot of violence and a lot of things that I cannot fix. And in my character, I'm very pragmatic. I'm solutions team. So I think that was part of what I needed, to work in something that I was able to intervene directly. Because memory, truth, that's important. But it starts to feel frustrating for me, because memory and truth are like long-term politics and issues.
Yeah.
And sometimes leave out the specific change or the particular change.
So you were then working with peasants and indigenous communities in Cali. What was that like? How was that part of your life?
I think one of the happier times of my life, one of my favorite jobs, especially
really?
I become very attached and close to that community of Yurumangui River in Buenaventura. Because before I have met indigenous organizations, peasant organizations, women, but it was the first time that I was so close with a Black community and gave me another perspective about the social movement, but also about our history and how important is the contribution of Black community to our history, and how this is, despite all the violence and colonialism, connected with Africa and with my own story. I felt Black myself, part of me. Like I felt my mestiza was fulfilled with that experience. I was like, I am this too. And that was amazing also because they have this social resistance to conflict, using singing, using like environmental initiatives that are very effective and very beautiful and give me a lot of hope about how they protect their territory, how they use the humor to survive, the dancing. So they are very alive community that resists also to guerrillas, paramilitares, army. And for me, that was like very inspiring. I'm still in contact with them. And for me, it's one of the most important places and organizations, social movement that I have met ever.
Why did you leave then?
I applied to the master's degree in Irlanda, Northern Ireland. I studied in Derry, where the troubles started. I applied for a scholarship. I got it. Now, there are a lot of peace and conflict programs in Colombia. But at that moment, we don't have any. And we were in the middle of negotiation with FARC. I was working in the South, which is where it's very important focus of conflict. And I applied for this scholarship. Of course, I got it. I went there, and the plebiscito happened when I was there. I even tried to quit the scholarship because of the pain.
I can imagine.
When we lost the plebiscito, because I was like, why I am studying peace and conflict because we were in this path finally. So when we lost the plebiscito, I went with the director of my university in Northern Ireland, and I told him that, and he was like, take a month to think about it. He's South African, so he knows a lot of conflicts
Apartheid, too. And he was teaching in Northern Ireland, so he must have been familiar with the Good Friday Agreement as well. He must have seen a lot.
He was he's a psychologist too, so he was talking from trauma. And even he asked me to do a comparative essay between what happened in Ireland, Northern Ireland with the Good Friday, and what happened in Colombia. And that helped me to process.
I'm sure.
But that's why I left Cali, because I got the scholarship. And my idea was, after the master degree, I'll be back to Cali. And then
Why was the plebiscite personally important to you?
Because it was like, again, like seeing in perspective, when I was studying at the university, when I studied conflict, I never imagined that in my life, I'll be able to see a peace attempt like the one that happened with FARC in the Havana.
Right.
So I felt betrayed from my country and from my colleagues, my peace colleagues, because I found them core responsible of our defeat, because there was a lot of, that's not too much, votes that we need, and we have our doubts about the peace agreement. Every organization made their campaign apart, and there was like, in my perspective, a lot of people didn't took seriously the campaign, the Yes campaign. So but I did, because I'm also duty driven, right? If I have a mission, I'm gonna accomplish this mission, and I have this moral capacity that say, okay, I have these views, but this is my job, and I'm gonna make it right. And that was my perspective about the peace agreement. I was like, it's not that I was thinking that was the perfect agreement, but I knew that was very good agreement. That was very important attempt in our history to take us closer to the peace, and I was committed to that. So I felt betrayed, and I felt, that we were losing an historical opportunity. I still believe that loss affect what happened after with the peace agreement.
How?
Because it took part of their legitimacy. The peace is not popular. War is more popular than peace. So that's these symbolic moments are really important to protect something like the peace agreement.
How did your parents feel when the plebiscite failed?
They felt sad too, but they were here. Yeah. And I was there, and I was basically, I have like a small depression episode. So I didn't want to talk with them. I just wanted to talk with my best friend because in my mind, she was the only one that was committed in the same way that I was committed. Because everyone else felt to me like they betrayed me somehow.
Wow.
Yeah, I was really into that.
So it was personal for you.
Yeah, it was personal.
In fact, let's rewind a little bit, and I want to talk about the period before you ended up going to Northern Ireland. That was the time, as far as I can recall, that President Uribe was in power.
No, Santos was already in power.
Okay, so Uribe was around the time when
I was in Santa Marta.
Santa Marta, yes, exactly. So, from what I have read, President Uribe, along with Santos, who was his defense minister at the time, were directly or rather indirectly responsible for a lot of falsos positivos cases, which created a huge scandal in Colombia. Now, at that time, you were also with the Truth Commission. How did that make you feel, knowing that you are trying to uncover the truth and honesty from what people did, but on the other hand, you have a government which is actively working towards covering up the truth? What was it like for you working in that space?
Yeah, not just falsos positivos, but in general. It was strange for me in my journal story too, because I became from National University. We're against the government. Yeah. And I never imagined that I came from that like super anarchist way of view to after be working with a state institution.
Yeah.
But I think it was something like when you're a political scientist, like I am, you understand that the state is huge and the government is huge too and complex too. So Gonzalo Sanchez, who was the presidente del Centro de Memoria Histórica, is a very recognized academic from the social movements, the historical perspective, and all the people that work with them. Álvaro Villarraga, who was the chief of Acuerdos por la Verdad, he's a former combatant from the EPL guerrilla. So I was like, for me, I was not working for Santos or Uribe. I was working for them. So I trust them. And it's like, it wasn't, I was sure of the truth too. You know, at the time, I remember about falsos positivos. Since 2008, I was in China because I went for make a course and wherever. And I remember that the Colombians that I met, they were in denial about falsos positivos in that time. And I was like, I'm sure. And they were like, you have no evidence. I was like, it's true, I have not like evidence from a trial, but I'm super sure about this is a fact that is happening. And you know, like years later, we have the evidence, the hard evidence. So it's like also that I have not this dilemma in my head thinking, oh, maybe that is true or not. No, I was sure that was true, but on the other hand, I have this job to do.
Okay, so after the plebiscite, when the peace agreement was signed, agreed upon, became legal, all of that happened, you came back to Colombia at that time, right? And then what? Did you...
Yeah, I wanted to come back to Javeriana University at Cali to keep in contact with the social movements and that. But I got the offer from HEP.
Okay.
And after Northern Ireland, and I went to South Africa for 3 months to work in a project about transitional justice in 12 cases in Africa.
Okay.
So that also gave me perspective, both things, South Africa and Northern Ireland, about how important Colombian case was, not just for Colombians, but also for the world.
Of course.
So when I came back, I was like, I changed my perspective of betrayal to hope and optimism about how important was the Peace Colombia make it true to help to the human beings to believe in peace again somehow. So when I got the offer, I got 3 offers at the same time, like Javeriana, HEP, and working with the Sustitución de Cultivos.
Mm-hmm.
That was the part of the peace agreement too. But yeah, HEP seems like the most important among them, the more interesting, because it was this unique transitional justice system. And also I have, the chance to design the research from scratch. So I was like, okay, I took that.
What was your time at the HEP like? Did you like it? Because I ask because the kind of cases you must have heard, seen at the HEP must have been very different to Santa Marta. They must have been a lot more emotional, a lot more graphic.
No, actually they were similar.
Okay.
Also because my boss there, she is from Santa Marta.
Okay.
I met her there. Mm-hmm. She is a victim. Her father was disappeared from paramilitaries.
Right.
So her personal story is very interesting. And she was the magistrate that designed a territorial case in HEP. Because the other ones decided to took a crime. Like kidnapping or falsos positivos or raping. But she was one of the magistrates that fight inside to be able to have this perspective. And that's because when she was a victim in Santa Marta, she understood, but also a lawyer and a political activist, that the conflict is it happens in a territory. It changed the way that the people relate, and is what we live together too. So the first case that she opened is the Urabá case. Also because she cannot work in Caribe because she had bias for being a victim. Then she looked for something that was similar to what she know. And Urabá was very similar because of all the actors, guerrillas, paramilitares, drug trafficking, but also a lot of the conflict is related with the territorial control. So it was similar in a way because we have a similar perspective. She also studied at National University. We have a similar ways of viewing the conflict, but also the peace and the social resistance. Was very intense. I was 2 years there, but it felt like 10. Because we have a lot of challenges. Some of them related with the work itself, but some of them like bureaucracy, president have changed. So Ivan Duque was not supporting the peace agreement. So
I heard.
He made our work more difficult. He took our budget. So it was a new institution. So sometimes we have troubles like, I don't know, we don't have toilet paper because the contract has not started. Things like that. We don't have computers. We don't have chairs. So a lot of the energy, my energy, was invest in bureaucracy and logistics and not in the research itself. And that was very exhausting.
Did you get to visit or witness any cases, any trials?
Not from my case. I was part of the some of the audiencias from the other cases that started first, and were somehow related with our case. For example, falsos positivos that happened in Urabá. So I went to listen them, but I was mostly in the research and preparing the profiles, the methodology that will support the research in HEP. I was a weird element in that moment because most of the people were lawyers. I was a social researcher because my boss wanted to have the social research perspective too. She was not just penal research, but that was true, but it was also true that at that moment was more needed to fix some of the legal issues that were like worrying everybody because, Colombia is very legalist. So a lot of the work in transitional justice has been invested into protect the process, which sometimes paralyzes the process. And that was exhausting for me as a social researcher too. Even though I understand that's necessary, for me, not being a lawyer was frustrating sometimes.
But it also must have been a chance for you to bring an alternate perspective, right? A different perspective to, how justice was being delivered almost.
Yeah, and I have this old question since the Truth Commission work about the justice, how my hypothesis was. In the neighbors or towns or places where institutional justice or autonomous justice was weaker, the armed groups were more able to become powerful.
Yeah.
But in those places where people have rather state institutions that bring them justice, or indigenous people or Black people or peasant communities that bring justice, they were weaker. So I think that was something that I brought to help also to give context to the idea of transitional justice that we were proposing, and also my experience in the other countries. Because sometimes I felt that Colombians, since our conflict have some features, were too convinced that we are so special. And they even have this sui generis, that our conflict is sui generis.
Yeah.
So our peace is sui generis, and we are the only ones doing this at the world. And sometimes I'm like, no, we are not that special. And it's, like being that violent, that doesn't make us like special human beings. And I think also that, thinking HEP, the design was also inspired from other conflicts in the world.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I actually wanted to talk to you about justice a little bit more, the idea of justice itself, right? A lot of people, for example, that I've met who have lost loved ones to violence, conflict, or whatever, the idea of justice that a lot of them often have revolves around the notion of wanting their killer or wanting the criminal to be punished, to be jailed, to be imprisoned. It takes an extraordinary amount of strength to be able to forgive, to be able to directly confront face to face the person who is responsible for killing somebody that you loved, for killing somebody that you were related to. During the time you were at the special peace jurisdiction, I'm sure you must have been an audience member to a lot of trials and proceedings. Did you ever get a chance to directly meet with the families and people of victims who were sitting in the audience as well? What was the idea of justice that they had in their mind?
Not exactly the ones that were in this exact audience, but I met a lot of families and also victims there and before, and which surprised me a lot of them, the majority of them, they didn't want a jail for the responsible. They wanted truth. That's what I found in my experience. The majority of people wanted truth and social justice, but not jail. Especially, I think that's very shaped from the political views too. In general terms, I found that the people, like the middle class and poor people victims, felt more close to restorative justice or transitional justice rather than the high-class victims that wanted more punitive justice. In terms of trends, right? That doesn't mean that there is not.
Of course.
Yeah, that's what I found.
Why? Why do you think that was the case?
I think one reason is because when you live in a small town, like Jurumangi, for example, young people that went to FARC or to army or to paramilitary forces were all neighbors, cousins, brothers, sisters. So people really wanted more to repair their community, their territory, their social story, rather than punish that specific boy than when two paramilitary forces were part of the ones that killed the others. Mm-hmm. But when you live in a city, when you have money, you have the privilege and also the pain of being separated from others. So you don't really need to make peace with this responsible, because it's somebody that is far from you and from your life, daily life. Also because I think people from like high class or victims in cities saw the conflict a lot from TV, and the media have grown feeling of revenge, of terrorism, of these kind of narratives that contribute to this punitive system and view about the conflict that is really different than the ones that live the conflict during a lot of time, and they wanted more peace than anything else, than even justice. They just wanted to be in peace for some time, because the most of time they have new violence. So I think that might be the reason. I never thought about it. It's the first time that I really thought about it.
Yeah, it's something that I often think about, because I remember reading about the different kinds of justice when I was at university: restorative, punitive, transformative, transitional as well. You know, one question that always stayed on my mind was that you've lost somebody in your family. You've lost somebody that you loved, somebody you cared about. You as a person will have to live with that loss for the rest of your life. Nobody you meet will ever be able to replace what you have lost. Nobody will be able to. Now, that sense of loss comes with a great deal of grief as well, and trauma. Despite grieving, being able to directly look the person in the eye who is responsible for killing the person you have lost and forgiving them, it takes an enormous amount of strength. As a human being, it is only natural for you to want that person to be punished for what they've done, for them to take accountability for what they've done. That accountability can take many different forms. But the very first time I remember when my ideas about justice itself were challenged was when I read about and saw documentaries on the Gacaca tribunals of Rwanda.
Yeah.
And that is something I had not anticipated before. It is not something that I knew about before either. For me, it was deeply inspirational. And to know that a similar process took place in Colombia as well, but one that was mandated by the government, was pretty unique, was pretty different. Having said that, were there any moments, for example, experiences where the atmosphere in a courtroom at the HEP during trial became really dramatic, became very emotionally charged?
Well, before that,
yeah,
I wanted to refer to the part related with Gacaca trials, similar, because that's one thing that I forget.
Yeah.
Where I tell you about my old question about justice was related to in Colombia, in peasant communities, indigenous, Black, even the neighborhoods in Bogota, they have experiences in justicia comunitaria.
Okay.
That are previous to the peace agreement.
Okay.
And it was funny when sometimes at HEP, where we were making reference to Gacaca in Rwanda, and sometimes I was like, yeah, that's very important and it's very well known, but we did that here in Colombia.
Wow.
A lot of times. That's La Guardia Indígena, La Guardia Cimarrona, they're examples of justicia comunitaria in Colombia. And they were able to sustain peace and transfer conflicts in a peaceful way, or at least in a less violent way, because sometimes, of course, los latigazos, of course, that's violence. But it's a less violence give somebody 20 latigazos instead of send him 20 years to jail. Also in South America, I was in Guatemala for pleasure. And there I found a lot of experience from indigenous communities that have their community justice system that is very similar to transitional justice. And they have a lot of legitimacy, of course, in the absence of a state.
Right.
And they were quicker, they were more effective, they have more legitimacy than the punitive system of the states that took time, have corruption, is not... Here people, they know the judge, I saw things like, okay, testimonies, and every person can speak, and they actually listen, and they gave free time to talk. Sometimes I found that this kind of justice that have less protocols actually works better. So yeah, just to highlight that it's a paradox that in Colombia we had a lot of that justice experience that are not well recognized even in the transitional justice system.
That's really interesting.
But they are become more and more recognized because the people itself, the victims itself that have experienced those kind of justice are showing them. But with the sanción propia, the TOAR in HEP, I think they still have a lot of way to arrange, to explore these kind of sanctions that indigenous peasants and Black people had. Part of the work in HEP that is not well known but is happening since the beginning is a dialogue between the indigenous justice system and HEP. And I remember at that beginnings where it was a equal conversation, like, okay, we have this experience in justice as HEP, but you have experience in justice too. So how, when we talk, we can find a common sense in the way that we're going to do this, especially in the part of the la sanción, not at the end of the trial. Okay, and back to the audience. It was always emotional. It was always emotional for the team, the people attending, the victims, the combatant, the magistrates. Like, it's a very, very hard, emotionally exhausting for everyone that is involved. And part of something that I miss, if you compare HEP with the Truth Commission, is at the Truth Commission in South Africa, they have a stronger, like, psychological trauma perspective than here. Here is more legalist. Even though there are a team in HEP that is in charge of that, but it has not the same importance as the lawyer part. And I miss that at my time, to be more supported.
That's something I will want to talk about in a while. But you said that at the HEP, cases and hearings were always emotional. Now that can take a toll on anybody's mental health. To see and hear and witness such cases every single day. How did you take care of your mental health at that time?
I did not. But at that time, I noticed it because I did not take care of my mental health either when I was at the Truth Commission. And I think at the Truth Commission was worse because at the Truth Commission, I was in region. Yeah. And Colombia is a very centralistic country. At least here, I had some benefits and privilege that the city has, right? I went to theater, I went to cinema, have a nice dinner, like free time.
Yeah.
But there, additionally, we have problems with logistic, with weather, no water, things that make things worse. But thanks to HEP, thanks to the pressure that I received, that it did not become just from the hearings, but also from all the political pressure, the anxiety of giving results, the personal anxiety to do something about peace that was starting to lose popularity and resources. I quit and I started psychotherapy just like 1 week after, something like that. I went to Vipassana.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay.
like it's a part of finding something to heal.
I'm aware of Vipassana.
I went to Vipassana and then I start therapy.
That's really interesting.
And I go to psychotherapy regularly since then.
One thing that I have heard about Colombia, the HEP, from a lot of people I've met here, was that often, even right after the peace agreement was signed, there were still factions within Colombia that did not support the peace agreement, that did not want the peace agreement to go through. There were people who wanted to actively use violence to fight against the state, etc. Did you ever feel that there was a target on your back because you were working with the HEP?
No.
So there was never a moment where you felt scared that, oh, okay, I might be in danger because I'm working with the HEP?
No. But I think it's because we get used to it. It's like same with the mental health.
Yeah.
It's like at that time, most of my colleagues, same like in the Truth Commission, we don't think we need mental health support. Because for us, this violence, these kind of talks, hearings are landscape. It's something that is normal for us.
Like it comes with the job.
Yeah, so it's normal. But then after the years, and when I realized, I noticed that we need mental health support, but also with danger. I think since it came with the job, we were used to it. We didn't know the danger that we were facing. But I now I remember two things. One thing is I was victim from the, this is unrelated, but it's not. El paseo millonario. It's a way of stealing here. And I was working at the HEP at the moment. So at the beginning, the guy in the taxi, he took my ID.
Okay.
And he started to ask questions about my job.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, I started to think that was job related. After 30 minutes or something like that, I noticed it was a simple stealing. But in terms of my mental health, I suffered a lot to try to think if this was related or not with the job I was doing.
I'm sure.
And then later, when I was already outside HEP, Paloma Valencia, who is a Congress member, she did an audience in the Congress against HEP. And what her team did was to research some of the HEP members to try to connect them with FARC and say that they were not legitimate to be part of HEP because of their links. And I was in that list. I wasn't working there anymore, but I was in that list because when I ran from election, I was part of an organization that was called in that moment Fuerza Común. And the researchers, very good researchers, they were doing something like, okay, Fuerza Común and FARC party that was like Fuerza del Común is the same. Yeah. Even though when my Fuerza Común existed, the political party didn't exist. But that's something that I know. But I appear in the Congress debate as part of FARC political party in 2010. And in their view, in their way of presenting myself, I was part of the FARC.
My goodness.
And the problem is not to be or not. It's the way that they manage the truth, the speech in a place like Congress. I remember that I was already outside the HEP and I was like, should I do something? Should I stay quiet? A lot of people called me. A lot of people tried to tell me that we should ask for, the repair they changed their speech. But I finally did nothing because I knew that from these kind of people that Paloma, Valencia work with, I'll be more exposed if I defend myself rather if I keep quiet. So it's like what just happened at the beginning. You ask me and I say, no, it was a normal job. But then when you ask a little bit, and especially from an outside perspective, you notice that some things happen to you and you normalize. Like, okay, that is a country where this happened. But maybe in another country, if you are difamado at the Congress of your country, you fight back. But I did not.
So at what point then did you decide to shift towards peace building through art and culture? This must have been a pretty difficult time for you, right?
Yeah. It was like after that, but I had the idea of doing it after leaving HEP, but the pandemic started. So I already started to study theater with more rigor, but the pandemic came and I lost all my savings in 5 minutes. So I came back to like the similar at the mayor in Bogotá.
Yeah.
I work with the Alta Consejería de Paz, Víctimas y Reconciliación.
Mm-hmm.
But I tried to go in a different way. So I designed a strategy for reconciliation in a communitarian level in Bogotá. And well, I tried to make some contributions in that level. But again, I found myself trapped in a lot of time and energy with the bureaucracy, with the time that takes a project to go through. And that made me exhausted, so I quit. But it was fun and nice for me to design this strategy. Now that I remember to thinking again about how to strengthen the people and the organizations that keep the justice or the peace beyond what the state could do or not. And then, yes, I was like, okay, this is enough. And I met Prolongar. Prolongar opened a call, like 10 scholarships to teach their methodology.
Yeah.
Which in paper was like, we work with arts and communication languages to build peace. So I applied because I was like, okay, this is what I'm looking for. And I got the scholarship. I was one of these 10 people and was like love at first sight. They create like this 10 people team, like consultants that they were gonna call eventually from a project. And they called me 1 year later. During that time, I was teacher at the university, teaching peace and conflict. Yeah, I'm been working with them like 2 years now.
Mm-hmm.
There, I was able to find this dialogue, respectful and rigorous dialogue between peace building and working with arts, including theater.
Somebody we actually spoke to on this podcast before told us about similar workshops that they had conducted in communities where they brought together people from the paramilitaries, the army, ex-combatants, victims and survivors together. Now for me, even visualizing a room filled with such people is pretty nerve-wracking. It can create a lot of tension because the victims would know you are responsible for killing my son. It can create a lot of
tension.
Did you have such workshops as well? How did you work with people belonging to different groups together in a way that maintained, composure?
That's part of what the strengths of prolongar. And I think that came from art. For us, the space is very important, a physical space.
Yeah.
So the light, that we have enough space so people are not forced to have like physical contact if they don't want to. We usually put an altar or something where we have light, flowers, objects that create a nice atmosphere. And we use a lot when we create pieces, we think a lot in the colors, the kind of letters that we use, that visually the space, it feels nice, it looks good. So first of all that. Second, the common agreements. For example, a question that we use in all our workshops to build the agreement is, what do you need to feel comfortable in this space?
Okay.
And then we propose some values like no judgment. You don't have to do some of the exercise if you don't want to. You can leave anytime that you want. You can keep silence. You can ask, this kind of principle basics that start to build a safe space. Also the listening, as I was saying before, like a deep listening. Do not force people to keep through the workshop that they are doing if they are not feeling comfortable. Or if, for example, we worked recently in a school and they were just 6 teachers. But by chance, there was a recent conflict among 3 of them.
Okay. Tell me more.
And they talk about the conflict outside the workshop with us, was related with the way of they deal with the difficult students. Because one teacher was more traditional, conservative, punitive, and the other was more restorative justice.
Yeah.
Like even the one that was more punitive, make fun of them, telling them that they are not hip, that they are teachers. And they were fighting each other because a student that was also in our workshops defeat the conservative teacher, telling her that she was not a good teacher, she wrote a letter, and the other teacher support the student. So she called this one a traitor.
Oof.
So that was the conflict. And that happened in the middle of our workshop. We did not treat the conflict itself in our workshop because that was not our goal. But I see how the tools that we share with them that are related basically with self-emotional regulation, how I relate with whom is different to me, and with communication, help them to reduce the tension, to give them perspective about the dimension that we're given to that. Like even we do an exercise that is La Rueda de las Dimensiones. So people write the groups that they identify with when they were teenagers, and then when they were adults, and how these identities or these groups shape the way that they relate with different people and prejudice. And it was very moving in one moment than one of those teachers that were in conflict noticed that both of them have lived through their parents' death recently, and that was very shocking to their lives. And that was a moment with, they empathize with something that happened in their lives that is not related at all with the conflict that was happening in the high school, but open a space of recognizing the humanity in the other person. That's one of our purpose. We are not having a reconciliation approach when we expected two people to take a photo, shaking their hands and saying, I forgive you or I love you. We are not pretending that. We want to contribute to people to open a space, mainly in themselves, to recognize to the human being that they have in front. If they can go further, it's good, but we don't force that. And part of our success is precisely that. Is when that happens, is because people feel safe to do that. Otherwise, they go as further they want to go with the tools that we give it to them.
But then that process also would be very emotional, right, for them? It would be pretty difficult to do that as well. I'm sure there must have been moments where the process became so intense for people that they probably would not have been able to deal with their emotions at that point in time.
Yeah, and that's where art is very useful.
Okay.
We have a book that we are going to share with you that is called Arte para Reconstruir. It's a summary of our methodology of reconciliation using Kintsugi technique.
Okay.
Through the using of art, like Kintsugi or theater or the work with the body, we found and participants found a space to deal with these intense emotions, to give them a place without necessary talk about it. So yeah, it's like a sort of emotional validation through the art. And sometimes when we open the space to talk, people talk about it. But sometimes they don't, and we don't force them. But we saw them. We saw how they behave when they're repairing or when they're drawing, and what they say. Sometimes, even if they don't talk about the trauma directly, they talk about how they feel more free or, more safe or more relaxed after doing this, after give a space, because some of what happened also with trauma, with victims here, and or even in the case of the high school, they're so busy responding to their daily lives, to their duties, that they have never stopped to give them some breathing, some time, some space for their emotions, their trauma, and their conflicts. So just having the space is a big step for transformation.
Okay, then now, every organization, especially a non-profit organization, working in a human-centric space like this, related to peace building, conflict resolution, human rights, etc., often develops metrics by which it measures its success. Have you had any failures?
Yeah, we do. Like, we don't, I felt we never have enough time to go as deep as we want to, because the resources of, basically time are never enough. So in the case that I was talking to you about the high school, in the ideal world, if we have more time, we can have more sessions to finally be able to have the trust and safe space to actually go through that specific conflict and try to transform it till the end, and not let them to do if they want or not.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
Also, with people with major trauma, even if we work with art therapy and also some of the therapy principles and traditional psychology, we are able to content what is happening in the workshop, but not what happened after. And we know that we open some Pandora's
boxes, yeah.
And we measure our work. Sometimes we're more specialized, like external enterprise or consultant do the measurement, or we do it. We try to make follow-up sessions after 2 weeks or 1 month. We try to close the process, but we know that it's not enough. And we would like to be able to have more sustainable interventions across time, but the funding still doesn't support that as much, right? We present some projects that are focused in just one high school, for example, and that's not sexy for the donors. Donors like to have numbers, big numbers, but deep inside, we wanted to go deeper with less people, but we're still fighting for the funding to be able to do that.
The kind of work that you do and what you've described to me is really specific and niche. And funding is within the broader realm of human rights and peace building, difficult to come by. No doubt about that. How do you find the balance in your projects in a way that A, meet the needs of the community that you want to work with, and B, also speak to donor requirements and expectations in a way that they agree to fund your project because they find it sexy and appealing? How do you find that balance?
Well, I think we are very honest with the work that we propose to do, both with donors and with participants. Like with the donors, we have evidence from the previous measurements that we have, from testimonies of our participants, that somehow our work works.
Okay.
Right? So that's something that, and we have 36 years experience, even though just from these 36, 10 are working in peace issues. But we have evidence that what we do works. Also, we are very strict with the way that we manage funding and administration. So we have a really clean CV in that regard. And with participants, we are very honest. We don't promise anything beyond what we can do. So we're like, yeah, we manage expectations in a very honest way. Sometimes even some participants are like at the beginning, like not that interested, because it's like they are more used to listen big promises.
Yeah.
But then they engage with the work quickly when they start to experience like a different way of working. I remember a student telling me in the evaluation process something like, how do you manage to treat us with love, even with people like us? We are the bad guys in the high school. Wow. Nobody loves us. Okay. We are like terrible. And you still treat us with love. How do you do that?
Wow.
And you know, things like, and we're like, okay, we're doing something that is important. Or another kid that was telling me like, how do you not feel shame and make us do not feel shame? And when you listen things like that, you are like, okay, our work is worth it. And of course, when you show a donor testimony like that, even if it's not a hard measure, they want to fund you again. Because it's like, okay, something is happening there. And again, I think that's thanks to the mixing between art and taking serious the social context, respect the people, don't patronize them, just like actually listen them. We are not their friends, but we try our participants independent if they're victims or kids or wherever, like they're other human beings like us. And we also participate in the workshop sometimes, like we cry with them, like we make their exercise so they even we have a activity that is called Humanidad Compartida. And that's one of our main goals. If at least we create a space where they can see each other and ourselves like other human beings, we are contributing to peace.
How is your work at Fundación Prolongar different to the peasants, indigenous communities, etc., that you work with earlier in the south? Yeah, in Cali.
It's similar somehow because in Cali, I was a lot of space to propose. So I proposed a documentary that we did with Yurumangui people. I proposed a board game and also some cartillas, like pedagogical material for work with this organization to talk about their topics, their pieces, their social movements. But here, this is go through other level.
Right.
First of all, because my colleagues are artists too, dancers, art therapists, so they know at least artistic language like properly. Same like I know theater. They also very rigorous about their work. Like especially rigorous. And also they work with trauma. Or we work with trauma. And that was new for me, especially coming from a story that where I denied my own trauma. So it was a safe space for me to be able to know how the trauma is working in myself, but also to recognize that there is trauma also in the people that we work with and give a place and a space for that. And I found that very careful and distinctive, even if I compare with the work in HEP, in the mayor in Bogota, because it was not like psychologists do that apart.
Yeah.
It's like we do that all together.
I'm sure.
Because we think we are working with human beings. And when we work with art and communications, we try to work with the different dimensions of the human being. So not just their mind, but also their emotions, their body. And I found that very transformative, starting for myself, because like in this training that I got the scholarship, there's small questions since the beginning, like, how do you feel today for doing this job? Like, where is the place where you start? How is your body? And I was never asked before, like, for me as a human being, I was a worker, a thinker, a researcher. But I have no needs, apparently, before. Or I didn't recognize them that well, like in Prolongar.
So after working with Prolongar for almost 2 years now, what is today your opinion about the relevance or the utility of art and culture in building peace?
Well, that started before.
Yeah.
I wanted to make that reference. When I was in Northern Ireland,
yeah,
I make a volunteering in an organization that was Kulturland, called Kulturland.
Okay.
And the idea of them was building bridges between Republican community and Protestant community in Ireland by showing them through culture that they have more in common than they think. So they use theater, movies, dancing to show them that. And that was very effective. So I think that's in the recent times, after all what happened at the university, when I connect again with that and saw how effective and quickly this happened.
Yeah.
That's part of what I have seen in Prolongar. For example, we are in a project right now that is called Garabatos al Colegio. Is like peace education in high schools, in public high schools. And we do 4 workshops with students, 2 workshops with teachers and one workshop with parents.
Okay.
That's very small amount if you compare with the changes that we saw. And I think that is thanks to, first of all, the use of arts and communication, because it connects, it touch quickly the emotions, the body, it desarma. It also allows the mind and the body to explore, to free a little bit about the tension that the violence cause. Also the view, the methodological view from Prolongar is to adapt to the context, but really doing that. I have listened that before, I have done that before, but in Prolongar, we did that in a very deep way. We design our, guide, but we really listen, like all the time. Like we listen the body, we talk among the facilitators, we fill the space, and if we need to do change at the moment for this working better, we do all the time. That is very exhausting for us because we cannot have perfect standards that we can reproduce every time.
Of course.
That's more effort. It costs more money to more time. But at the end, it had better effects in people because people notice it, that they are listening, that they are actually participating, that their body feels different, their mind feels different. We work also with meditation, yoga. So sometimes people just thank us to remember that they can breathe, to deal with trauma or to deal with conflict. So there are small changes, but very powerful, right? They remember what they, this work with the teachers, for example, we did last year, and then we come back this year. And it was very exciting that some of the teachers and also the students, just when they saw us, was like, these people is back. Like, yes, we're doing this again. And they they don't remember like really how the concepts are called, but they remember the experience, why they felt that something shifted. And that's very cool.
Like they remember the programs that you do, how it makes them feel.
Yeah.
At that given time. And that feeling itself is long lasting.
Yeah.
Any conflict, almost always, it leaves a deep and lasting impression on your body, not just physically, but mentally as well. After being with Prolongar and the HEP and Kali and Santa Marta and Northern Ireland and witnessing conflict from many different dimensions and angles, where you find yourself in life today, how do you see the future of the conflict in Colombia? That's one. And the second is, what do you see as the future of peace itself in Colombia? Do you feel that there is hope for peace?
I think there is hope for people.
Okay.
And now I'm very focused in my work with Prolongar. I also work with another organization that is called Palabreras y Callejeras.
Okay.
They do street art with rural communities. And I'm also dedicated to be a theater actress and producer. And I feel that I choose that, and it's one of my happier moments in terms of professional work, because with those three things, I'm contributing to make people more aware about themselves, about their emotional experience, about their memories, about their identity, about how they can feel or not their stories of conflict and violence in their body, in their minds, in their story, be contributing to people be more aware about their relationships, how the way they relate with each other in families, towns, cities, or country contribute or not to building peace or to keeping conflict, and also to be aware about the big picture of conflict in the country and in the world.
Right.
I think that's the hope, to bring the reflection about conflict, violence, and peace closer to the people. Maybe it's because my own story too, because when everything started, that was so far from me, and was,
of course,
Jaime killing and other things that bring it next to me. But if I notice it, that even if I was not born in Yurumangui or Urabá or Santa Marta, but I'm in my home and I'm violent with my mom, with my neighbor, with my partner, and then in the street with somebody, cross me in the traffic light and I'm fighting, I'm contributing to peace or conflict. And I can choose in that space to contribute or not, the way I vote in elections, the way I think about the person that is different to me, the work I'm thinking about the FARC, the paramilitares, the enemy. And I think that builds cultural peace that lasted in time. I don't know what is going to happen with the big peace, the serious peace, because that's not my responsibility anymore.
Right.
I trust and I support the actual government initiative of total peace. I support the HEP. I support every institution, government, international cooperation that is working in the big peace. I think it's very important, it's legitimate. And sometimes I work as a freelancer in small jobs that are related to that, because I know that, and that's important. But I think the peace that is gonna last is in hands of people, because it's also what I have learned from indigenous people, from artists, from Black people, is like when the state is not there, when the FARC, when the paramilitary is not there, it's up to them to keep the violence or to keep the peace. So we need to have more tools to be able to do that. And arts and communication are super powerful to strengthening those tools, to create those tools on people.
Super interesting. Well, Nadanya, thank you so much for your time. It was lovely having you on the podcast, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. At Pax Politica, we tell stories throughout the world of peace building and human rights that aren't covered by mainstream media. And every bit of support from you would help us do exactly that. So hit that like button and share the video with your friends and colleagues. We'll see you next time, and thanks for watching. See you in the next one.